So hello, it's 6:30, so I think I'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to the first South Sound chapter meeting of 2021. I'm so glad you could all join us. I'm Deb Naslin, South Sound chapter chair, and I'm really happy to be here with you tonight. For our meeting tonight, I'm going to start with a few words, like 5 minutes or less, I promise. Then we'll move right into the presentation by our speaker, Scott Freeman. And follow that with a little Q&A session. Then Sarah Hammond will share some native plant slides with us. And this will be while we're opening up the Zoom session, so everyone has a chance to say hello, chat, share information, etc. Since these webinars are taking the place of our in-person meetings. So first, we want to acknowledge that the South Sound chapter is within the lands of the Coast Salish people, and we are grateful to them for their past and their ongoing natural resource management and native plant stewardship. Next, I want to encourage you all, if you haven't taken advantage of it yet, to purchase a WNPS calendar. And you can do that at the WNPS.org. Go to the store tab, and as soon as you enter the store, you'll see the calendar there. The calendar is filled with just gorgeous photos. Kevin Head, a member of the chapter, is once again one of the featured photographers. So that's another special thing about the calendar this year. And in addition to the photos, there are these great write-ups about the plants and their habitats, and as you see on your screen, maybe their bird or wildlife partners. So if you haven't gotten your calendar yet, now's the time to do it, because this is the last month that the calendars are going to be on sale. An added bonus to the calendars, if you are a WNPS member, $3 of your calendar purchase, of each calendar purchased, will go to your chapter for all the great activities that we undertake. I also wanted to invite everyone to join us next month, February 8th, for After the Blast. Eric Wagner is going to share some of the amazing findings of scientists involved in research at Mount St. Helens. And he's going to explore just some of the ways that scientists had to think in new ways about how life was responding to that devastating explosion of Mount St. Helens. You can register for this webinar by going to the WNPS, again, WNPS.org on your screen, and look for, there's a tab that says calendar. You probably already found it if you registered for this seminar. But we're there again on the calendar. Look for February 8th. And there are also some really wonderful programs being offered by chapters and the state plant society. So I encourage you to take a look there and see what's going on. Okay, I'm done. And so now I'm going to hand this over to Gail, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
It's always fun to figure out all the things I'm going to turn on. I'm really excited tonight. This is a very, very special time because Scott Freeman is going to talk about one of my favorite places, one of my favorite restoration areas that it's been a long time. I got to observe it for a long time as it's in its transition. But his talk is going to be on the restoration and preservation of the world. And He is he's currently a lecturer emeritus in biology at the University of Washington, and he works on ecological forestry, habitat restoration, and he's a writer. And a couple years back, I was on a hike with some people, and they were talking about saving Tarboo Creek, and I said, what? And so it was very exciting to find out that the book had been written, because this is, like I say, an area I really value. So this will be a very exciting presentation. And his wife also, Susan, is going to join with him, and they'll share. I'm sure there's going to be some sharing of the long, well, the many generations of people who have been involved in restoration and the sustaining a land ethic. So, Scott, I'll let you go. We'll let you take over now.
Great, thanks so much, Gail. And thank you all for being here. And I want to apologize for my confusion about the program in November, and thank you again for the invitation to be here again tonight and meet with all of you. It's an honor and a pleasure. Should be a lot of fun. So as Gail said, my family and I have been working on a restoration project along Tarboo Creek on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington for about 15 years. And to summarize this story, I can point to two sentences I wrote in the book that she referred to. One I used for the title of this meeting here tonight, "In Restoration is the Preservation of the World." You might recognize the play on Thoreau's famous dictum, "In wilderness is the preservation of the world." And the second quote for the book is this one: "We work to save wildlife and natural areas for the same reason we work to help our communities, friends, spouses, and children, because we love them." This is work that comes from the heart. And with that, I want to turn things over to my wife, Susan Leopold Freeman, to tell you how this work really got started.
Hi, everyone. Let's see, just a second here. How do I see this? Sorry. Okay. Our story goes back and really starts back in 1935 when my grandfather, Aldo Leopold, bought 80 acres of a worn out farm in central Wisconsin. My grandparents and their children, my aunts and uncles, were all living in Madison at the time, and everyone was really excited to hear that their father, my grandfather, had bought this farm in the country. My Aunt Nina later told me that she sort of imagined a little white house with a picket fence in front and geraniums in the summer. But they were all surprised and dismayed when one cold, drizzly winter afternoon they went up to see this property that he had bought. It was pretty drizzly and degraded and eroded, and the only building left on the site was this one that you see here, which was the chicken coop. My grandfather, Aldo, was standing with his back to us, and that's my Aunt Nina next to him, and then a friend of the family there. That's the old chicken coop there that actually had 3 feet of frozen chicken manure in it that they had to actually use a pickaxe to get out. But my father, Carl Leopold, was in high school at the time, and he was taking a photography class. So that was really lucky because he documented all the early years that they had at the shack. Here he climbed a tree on the edge of the property and took a panoramic view of 3 photos of what it looked like. The former farmer had cut the trees, had plowed up the prairie, and planted corn. The Dust Bowl years came, and the soil's really sandy, and all the corn failed. The sand blew away, and he was left with this pretty eroded stack of land, and the farmhouse burned. And so the farmer just left. And that's when my grandfather bought the property just for back taxes. The first year that they were all dismayed, but then they kind of got into working there and to try to make something positive of this land. The first year they planted 3,000 trees. That's my grandfather leaning over and my Aunt Estella, who was 8 at the time, planting trees. It was a dry year that first year, and all 3,000 trees died, but they kept planting, and every year they kept planting trees, and the trees grew. And here's my grandfather with standing next to the white pine. You can see how fast they were growing at that time. And this is the first time that somebody had tried to plant native vegetation and restore it back to the way it was originally. And it's in a field that we now call ecological restoration. This is the first time that it was tried. Here's my grandparents. Here are my grandparents and my aunts and uncles, except for my dad, who took the photo. Later, when I was grown up, I asked my aunts and uncles about the time that they spent at the shack. And they said that that's when they were the closest as a family, and they had so much fun. It actually, each one of them said it had just a major impact on their thinking for the rest of their lives. They came out to the shack from Madison. It was about a 45-minute drive every weekend, and often they brought friends to come and help too. My Aunt Nina summed it up really well in saying that the shack was nothing, but it was everything. Here is Aldo, my grandfather, at the shack, writing in his journal. He kept careful notes in his journal about what they were doing, but more importantly, he kept notes he was thinking about why they were doing this. And this is where his idea came about that later he called the land ethic. And it's the idea that we should care for land, not as a possession or a commodity that we can use for our benefit, but something that we can care for or nurture the way we do for people. And it's here where he started writing the essays and thinking about what he wrote in the book, The Sand County Almanac. He was turned down by several publishers before he was accepted. He actually got a letter a week before he died from Oxford Press that they would publish his book. And it's now been translated into 13 languages and has sold over 2 million copies. Here's a picture of what the shack looks like today. If you can remember what that chicken coop looked like in the first photo, it's on the right-hand side. Early on, they added that part on the left-hand side for bunk beds so that everyone could sleep there. It still has no electricity. They have a pump out in the front for water and an outhouse we call the Parthenon. It's on the National Historic Registry, and it's probably considered the most famous chicken coop in North America. Here are the pines that my grandfather and my father helped to plant back in the 30s. My dad actually used the trees when they were thinning them to build a house that he lived in until he died. So it's pretty cool that you can grow trees and build your own house and live in it in one person's life. This is my family's legacy. Scott and I met, we were both working at the shack one summer. And it was always our dream to have a place of our own that we could do restoration work on. And Saving Tarboo Creek, the book, is a story of that journey that we started with our kids and that we hope to pass on to this legacy to the next generation.
So as Susan said, we met at the shack, but our first schooling and then work brought us out to the Pacific Northwest, and that's where we continued actually launched into the work, she said, we dreamed about for so long, to do a restoration project of our own. So this map is familiar to you. We're just north of you on the Olympic Peninsula. And the area we found to do a project when we started looking in about 2003, 2004 is outlined here. So I'm showing you, this is Tarboo Bay and Dabob Bay, if you know this part of the woods. Quilcene Bay, we live in the village of Quilcene now. And Hood Canal is running right here. So Tarboo Creek is a little creek that runs north to south. It's only about 7.5 miles long, but it had a relic salmon population when we got involved in this project. This is early in the project, this is a picture of the creek looking from north to south now. So this is the Tarboo Bay and Dabob Bay you just saw on the map right here. And I want to ask you in the chat, I'm going to ask you to respond, and Gail has promised to monitor and let me know what you guys are opining. But if you look at the creek bed, what are you noticing here? If you follow my cursor, what are you seeing in this floodplain? Go ahead if you could and just type in. This is what the creek looked like in 2004 when this restoration project first got started.
It's almost straight canals. The creek has been channelized.
Exactly. Just a classic example of channelization of what used to be a meandering stream. And this was a dairy farm you're looking at right now for many decades, but dairy farming wasn't sustainable here because the soils are very poor and farms weren't competitive. It was actually abandoned for farming in the 1960s and sat derelict for many decades. We ended up buying some land just upstream of here, and it turned out to be the most degraded section of the creek. And you can see some of the photos. This was from our first visit in August of about June of 2004. The creek had been ditched and was about 6 feet deep. This is a friend of ours who was scouting possible projects with us, and she couldn't see out of the ditch. That's the way things looked when they started. And I'm sure all of you will recognize some of our very familiar friends and nemesis. The place was covered with reed canary grass and Himalayan blackberry. And so it was the creek bed itself was pretty much of a mess. And the uplands were not in that much better shape. The previous landowner had bought a farm from after a guy died who was a long-term landowner. They came in and it took out all the big western red cedars and then subdivided the properties and sold it off as lots. And it had actually been on the market for 4 years before we came in and bought it and took this project on. And one of the things, we've been shopping for restoration projects all over Western Washington, and one of the things that attracted to us was embodied by this guy right here, Peter Bales, who's been the driving force behind the restoration project we'll be talking about over the next few minutes. He had a small grant to sort of relieve the channel, to re-meander the stream. The thing that attracted to us is the idea that this is not just our family would be working on this. There's a whole community starting to form, agencies, tribes, private individuals, local organizations dedicated to trying to bring this stream back to life. So this was the first project in the summer of 2004. This is Bob Harrison from Pilchuck Excavating, who digs basements for a living 9 months of the year, but for several months of the year, he restores salmon streams. And here he's using a blade to open up the channel. This is step one in restoring a salmon stream is to get to re-meander, to make crooked that which was straight, is the way I put it in the book. So next step 2 is to, once you've got a channel dug that looks more like a natural stream, is to bring in DWB, down woody debris, to try to emulate what's going on in a mature forest to get wood back in the stream. And here's Bob trundling over with it. These are waste logs from nearby logging operations that weren't suitable for the mill. So they were dropped off on the site, and here's Bob bringing one over in an excavator. And when he dropped one in place like this, we'd hear him holler. He'd go, "Whee!" The fish will love that, like that. And actually, we just had a big flood, and so this is 15 years later now. This log just moved about 25 feet or more. The flood the stream is always remaking itself. All right, that's step 2. You've got a channel, a new channel that looks natural and it's going to act natural, especially with the down wood in it. Step 3, and I want you guys to contribute to the chat here, if Gail, if you would help me out. What are we doing here? So we've got material.
Oh, here it comes. Here they come. I was going to say they're being silent. Planting willow stakes.
Ah!
Stabilizing the bank.
Perfect. Anybody recognize this material here that I'm pointing at with my cursor?
Preventing erosion.
Yep, exactly. It's called coir. It's a jute netting that you can buy in big rolls. And once the raw bank has been excavated, you lay that, you spread straw, and we were using an annual rye as a cover crop for the first summer and fall to stabilize the bank. You lay coir over it and then drive these willow stakes. And these willow stakes now, a lot of them are 30 feet tall. It's just amazing how things grow in Western Washington. Oh, sorry. I wanted to point out, one of the really lovely things about this, took about 2 weeks, this project. Here again is Peter Bales. This is our son, Ben, who's now a PhD doing research on climate change and how birds are responding all over the world. And Susan, this is her father, Carl, and Estella, her aunt, who's still living in Seattle. She's 94 years old. They were able to come out and watch and help. And it was a beautiful thing for them to see. Now, our son Ben and son Peter are 4th generation of Leopolds that have done this type of work. Okay, next step. You've got erosion control and willow stakes planted to start revegetating this creek. What is Bob doing here? If you could toss some ideas into the chat for Gail to check out.
Gravel for salmon. Adding gravel for the reds.
Yep, exactly. And the first year, when the water was back in, there were 13 reds on this little stretch that was remeandered. It's about 1,500 feet of creek. So the salmon ladies just went crazy about having this gravel back to dig and build nests. So there's the completed channel. All the major steps have been completed, and it was a great moment in our lives and everybody who'd been working on this project to see the water come back into this stream and restore it to the kind of flows that it had been experiencing for thousands or tens of thousands of years. So that was the initial restoration project. And about a month later, this is Gene Jones, who's a elder and spiritual leader from the Salish Nation. Here, he's got a beautiful voice and was singing a welcome song to start off the ceremony to dedicate the restoration and thank all the people who'd done so much to make it happen. And about 2 months after that photo was taken, about 150 school children and their parents and aunts and uncles and relations showed up to start planting trees. So we planted about 3,000 trees that first weekend. These events are called plantathons, and there's been one going on every winter since, now involving a series of schools from the local area. And we've heard kids say that they, going off to college, I'll never forget one speech. The guy was receiving a scholarship award to study environmental science, and I had never met him, but he said, and he didn't know who I was, but he said, actually, I got started, my interest in ecology and conservation and the future of the planet started when I planted trees as a school kid along Tarboo Creek. And he's in this photo. So it's had a huge impact on the kids growing up with this project. They can come back and see their trees that are now 30, 40 feet tall. So this is what it looked like right after the initial revegetation. And just like Wisconsin in the 1930s, trees grow. And here's Susan and her dad looking at a Sitka spruce that's headed for the heavens here. So again, it was very lovely when Carl lived long enough to see this. And I'll never forget a story when every evening when family was visiting, we'd go out and look at the little trees when they were small to see how they were doing. And, you know, we'd be commenting as people walked along and saying, oh, you know, a deer browsed this fir tip leader off. It's going to be struggling now. Or, oh, we lost this wet red cedar. Or, wow, look at these alders are just taking off. And I heard Carl just over my shoulder say to himself and to the universe, he said, This is just what we did 60 years ago. It's just what we did. And after he died, we were able to buy 160 acres of upland forest, some of which had some really nice second growth on that you're looking at right now. And then some others that we're doing a lot of active forestry replanting on that was clear cut recently. But we call it Carl's Forest in his memory. So this is where we are today. This is another photo of the Tarboo Creek watershed, the floodplain, looking from north to south, very much as you did at the start of the slide deck. So you can see no more straight lines. Almost the entire main channel has been remeandered from headwaters to the mouth. And there's been a lot of success stories. This is the mouth of the bay. This is the end of Tarboo Bay and the opening of Dabob Bay. And if you just look at where my cursor is right now, about right here, this next photo was taken about right there. So in the chat, we're gonna have a little quiz section about wildlife coming back to the watershed now. Well, let's start off with this guy. Who is this?
Gray whale.
Nicely done. Yes, it's a gray whale feeding probably on shrimp in Dabob Bay. Isn't that a fantastic photograph? All right, this is going to be a little harder. If you remember flip phone days, that's what they look like. And let me circle this print. It's a little hard to discern. Any idea who left that track? This is right after the remeander was done. The trees were still little, and I found this track in the mud next to the stream.
Lots of bears coming in.
Lots of bears coming in, exactly, black bear. And this is a more recent photo captured on a wildlife camera. And I want to show you this. Susan, you found this, right? Yeah, you and Peter were walking around and she started yelling and said, come over and look at this. And my first job out of college was working on as doing habitat survey and vegetation surveys for the interagency grizzly bear study in Yellowstone Park. So I've seen a lot of bear sign, but this was new to me. So take a closer look at this. Can anybody figure out what is going on here? So this excavation, I forgot to put a knife or a pen down for scale, but it's maybe 6 inches deep, something like that. Yeah.
See, we're getting several answers. Dug up ants, a hornet's nest, a beehive, digging underground nest.
You guys are good. Wow. It's a ground nest wasp that these bears have excavated, and they were eating larvae and I suppose eating some adults as well. But man, talk about an expensive lunch. That was I'm sure that bear came away with more than a few stings. All right, who's this? We're seeing sign from these guys regularly now. In fact, they have a big scent marker right actually where this guy is standing right now. We've got signposts from the same animal active right now.
So lots of responses on river otters.
Yep, river otters. Good call. Good call. Okay, I love this next one. Everybody recognizes this guy, but here's, especially for those of you who have dogs and like to take them outside. If you're outside working, doing planting or botanizing or whatever outside, if your dog finds something smelly, like this guy is basically standing on the river otter sign. And if you've seen river otter sign, it's full of what I call gack, just all sorts of, what to us are disgusting fluids from all sorts of orifices. This is what that coyote did. And you might reckon just getting some perfume right behind the ears where dogs love it. Okay, who's this guy?
Mink.
Yes, minks are showing up. We see their tracks in scat regularly. And unfortunately, a neighbor lost a bunch of chickens to a mink last summer. This one.
Bobcats.
Yes, bobcats. Yeah, we love to find their sign. They're so, they're just amazing animals. And this one. This is a bridge we use regularly, by the way.
Mountain lion or cougar?
Yep, or puma, yep, all of that's a cougar, yep. Look at the size of that paw. Turned out to be a female. It was sighted later. Okay, we also had these guys coming back, and I'll just let you know that's a beaver. And we were thrilled when beavers came back to the creek. They're all over the watershed now. And that's been almost entirely since the work that Peter Bales and agencies and tribes and all these school children have spearheaded. They built a dam on our place, right about where the creek leaves our property, and we were thrilled. We lost a lot of the baby trees we'd planted to drowning, but we had a fantastic, not quite an acre flooded. And they built a lodge on our property. We used to hear the babies squeaking from inside the lodge, and when friends and family would visit, they'd first thing want, what are the beavers doing? Let's go down and look. Oh yeah, lots of ducks, kingfishers, great wildlife, tons of frogs, and we were waiting for cool aquatic plants to start showing up. When they ran out of food and the family left, abandoned, went elsewhere in the stream, and the dam broke, and we had challenge number one. So I'll never forget when Susan and I first started giving talks to folks about this project. One of the questions we would get is, have you had any setbacks? Have you had any challenges? And at one time I said, gosh, I hate to say this, but no, things have been going pretty well. But I'm going to tell you about 3 that have come up in the last couple of years. The first was a setback just in our restoration. Instead of this beautiful pond and restored forest, we had the most ferocious reed canary infestation you'd ever want to tackle. This stuff, I'm telling you things, it can get 9 feet high and as dense as dog hair. This is a friend yanking some out of the creek. So I'm sure you've all got favorite ways of dealing with reed canary grass. The Wisconsin DNR publishes a 50-page pamphlet going through all the options. What we decided to do was plant in it, replant mostly stakes, live stakes. And then we realized after a season or 2 of that, we have to do something about the reed canary, or those 9 feet canes. You've seen this will just fall over on your baby plants that were growing so nicely in July, and drown them, take them right down to the ground and kill them. They'll swamp them. So we started folding reed canary. This is my sister who's going through a patch right here. And starting in July, we would spend every weekend for 3 summers breaking the stuff down so that it couldn't, so the natives could grow over it. And after 3 summers of doing this photo was taken 2 years ago. The last time we folded, last summer, summer 2020, we didn't, because now the cottonwoods and the willows and the spirea and 9-bark and the other things, red osier dogwood that we have going, are getting high enough that they can withstand the reed canary. So we're starting to win this challenge. We're starting to tip the scales a little bit back toward good habitat. We'll always have a lot of reed canary in the habitat, but we're hoping a native understory will start to get restored once it starts to thin out from the shade. Challenge number 2 concerns salmon. So there were relic runs of chum and coho, and we have friends who grew up in the watershed and remember as kids, one of them said, I remember there being almost more fish than water when the salmon were running. So there were relic populations left after decades of degradation, but and as I mentioned, we had some wonderful displays of reds after the remeander started, but then this happened. Okay, so this is going to be, just to orient you to this map, this is Alaska. We're looking at the Pacific Northwest coast of BC here, trailing my cursor, in Washington State. What is this thing? So you need to look at this axis right here. And if you remember seeing these images, this is from 2015. Anybody in the chat recognize what this phenomenon was called?
The blob.
That is the blob, the infamous blob that is still, the ramifications are still being seen in the orca whale populations from the way it hit Chinook. There were tremendous seaboard die-offs, if you remember, in Southeast Alaska, in Northwest BC. Fishermen were finding lifetime fishermen in the Pacific Northwest were seeing species they'd never seen before. And we got creamed in Tarboo Creek. We went three autumns. Our run of chum and coho occurs in November and December, right after the fall rain start. We had nothing, no reds in our portion of the creek and upstream of us for 3 years. In fact, it's so recent, I don't have a photo yet. This fall, as of December, we have 5 reds on our property. Still none upstream of us yet, but 5 is better than 0. So we're hoping the runs are starting to recover from the blob. So we have some signs of hope for the salmon returning if the blob doesn't reform. This is a climate change driven event, as I'm sure you're aware.
Scott, can you talk a little bit more about what the blob is? And people are asking questions.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Gail, so much for that. The blob, and this is a scale, this is degrees Celsius up here. So these are temperature anomalies. This is a 30-year, if you take the 30-year average of surface water temperature over this period in this area of the Pacific, that would be average. So during the blob, this intense blob of surface water was 2 degrees centigrade higher than normal or long-term average. That is a disaster for ocean life. Warm water doesn't hold oxygen, so cold water adapted species are literally suffocating. So that was the blob, and it was called because it looked like that from space in these images that were published by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Thanks, Gail. And our third challenge that surfaced started when this map was published in our local newspaper, the Port Townsend Leader, in September of 2017. This was a proposal to develop a large commercial gun range and paramilitary training center. You'll notice on the screen right here, this is a lake in this aerial photo. That's Tarboo Lake. The creek, the tributary that drains Tarboo Lake actually runs through Carl's Forest into the main channel of Tarboo Creek. So this was right in our neighborhood. And the proposal of the company that proposed this was to have 7 gun ranges and 2 helicopter pads and long-term accommodations for people who were there for training. And after we did some research, we realized that this was not just about a gun range. The company is called Fort Discovery. It's headquartered in a neighboring county, and they're closely tied to extremist elements in the far right, including paramilitary groups. Their attorney has tweeted about encouraging the Second Civil War. So this is getting pretty close to home, given the events of last week. Specifically, the dream of this company was to develop this proposed area along Tarboo Lake and Tarboo Creek as what they call the rally point. So they're very closely tied to what people call the prepper world, if you're familiar with this, people who are anticipating the end of organized society and sort of a free-for-all, government-free free-for-all because of the breakdown of law and order. And what this company was pitching is that if you buy one of their assault rifles, they call the Expedition rifle, you would get this specially minted coin they call the Rally Point coin. And that when people in this world talk about when it hits the fan, or when all else fails is another phrase, you can bring your Rally Point coin and your AR-15, your Expedition rifle, and it's recommended 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Come to the rally point, and people, like-minded people, will be admitted to rally. And yeah, so this was the latest development in Tarboo Creek. We were part of a citizens group that got organized very quickly to oppose this proposal. We call ourselves the Tarboo Ridge Coalition. We were able to get signatures. Susan did a ton of tabling and petition gathering, often delivered 1,500 signatures or more. This is in a county of about 31,000 opposing the measure. And after years of work and widespread community engagement, the county commissioners and lawsuits, the county commissioners passed a law saying that any new gun range in Jefferson County has to be located indoors. So the company that made this proposal is predictably suing the county, claiming that their Second Amendment rights are being violated, but our attorney is very confident that the county is defending itself vigorously, and our attorney is confident that they'll win. So 3 challenges and 3 signs of hope in response to those, but the the fundamental message is that the creek keeps changing. The work goes on. We do planting parties with friends and family and interested folks every winter. Susan and I were out there this morning in the muck and the mire and the rain, doing a little erosion control work. And we do it because it's work we love. And I want to leave you with one thought that really spins off my favorite quote from Susan's grandfather's writing, from Aldo Leopold's writing. He said, "There are two things that interest me: the relation of people to each other and the relation of people to the land." Because what we've learned over these 15 years, this is friends and family looking at a salmon red in Tarboo Creek in the remeandered section. What we've learned is that this work is not only very important, but when you do it with other people, it becomes very powerful. And we not only make the land better, we make each other better. So I want to thank you for coming tonight and for the work all of you do on behalf of native plants in Washington State and beyond. It really matters, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts. And I think we'll have time for questions if you have any.
Yes, we do have some questions. Were the meanders put back into old meanders, or if not, how were they designed?
That's a fantastic question. Let me see, I'm going to stop screen sharing. Oh, where's my screen share? Sorry, I can't find my, here we go. Here's my Zoom face. Sorry, folks. Okay, back to the remeanders. I'll keep, well, I'm trying to figure out where how to unshare my screen. The remeanders were, almost none of the historic channel was left. So much of it had been degraded and a lot of it had been either plowed or compromised in some way. That the way there were sections of historic channel. So there actually was a civil engineer involved who does work like this. And he analyzed the existing meanders, and then we had data on stream flows, historic stream flows. So he modeled those and could actually model what the volume of the restored channel should be and when it would flood. And on average, how many times it would flood and how extreme the flood would be. So that's how it was designed, and sort of the size of the meanders could be done. What the size of the meander should be in their spacing. And it was interesting, the guy who did the plans, he got his draft done, and I said, would you mind if I sent him to Susan's uncle Luna, because he was basically the founder of river hydrology. And he wrote, I used this book when I was in college. And so yeah, Luna Leopold actually looked at the plans before they were implemented.
Did the creek temperature go down after the rehab?
We don't have the data to answer your question. My guess is that there wasn't much impact on temperature because the habitat was pretty open to start with. There were some alders lining the ditch on our area. And so it went into open pasture where the new meanders went in. So that could have elevated temperatures. Within 2 or 3 years, those willow stakes were up and starting to cast some shade. So if it did happen, it would have been reasonably temporary.
Okay, so I asked you a question, but I forgot to unmute. What type of soil and type of geology is there? And what's the source of the gravel, such as glacier, moraine, or yeah?
That is a fantastic question. And you know, when you do a project like this, you always think back, what would I do differently? And number one, so the gravel had to be brought in. I mean, we could have waited for the creek to scour the gravel out because it is, glacial deposit, as I'm sure you're probably aware. But the do-over would have been, we would have paid a lot more attention to soil type. We were planting pretty much based on exposure and slope, and we should have paid a lot more attention to. We've got a ton of clay, and so we have spots, one we called about an acre and a half. We call the dead zone because the clay is so intense there that, well, if you guys have followed the Elwha River restoration, the crews there, some of you may have planted up there for all I know, faced a similar problem. You have these very fine sediments deposited on some of these sites, and they bake. I mean, you can barely drive a pickaxe into them in the summer. And in the winter, they're saturated. There's standing water on it. It's a really tough area to revegetate. And we've really struggled. We've had some success with Western white pine, of all things, planting in those soils. And now we're trying more grand fir. But oh my gosh, we've had so many trees die in those soils. I'm looking at the chat, and if you don't
I have
mind,
to keep remembering to turn my mute off on.
okay.
Sorry about that. So my next question was, how is Estelle doing? And I took classes from her in the 90s.
Oh, that's fantastic. Estella's doing great. I mean, like all folks, she's still living independently in a wonderful community in Seattle. She just turned 94 and got her vaccine a couple of days ago. Susan talks to her every few days. She's writing a book about her mom, and so very engaged in that, and still wonderfully social. COVID's been as harder on her and her friends because they can't see each other. But she's good and still a wonderful force for good in the world.
So talk about those willows and how the stakes did the stick. So
yeah, we still do a lot of live stakes with willows and cottonwoods, and the willows, we've had really good success with them sprouting from stakes. In fact, we planted a bunch today, as a matter of fact, and we revegetated the reed canary grass with longer stakes to give us a chance of getting the reed canary beaten down below them so they wouldn't swamp the babies, but they'll sprout and do very well.
So,
oh yeah, here's a question: do the beaver eat the willow? And yes, they do. They love willow. Probably don't have any headaches because willow has salicylic acid in it. But yeah, they'll eat the willows, and we'll wire willows if they're right on the stream bank and the ones we really want to protect. But willows, you're probably, if they get big enough to have a root system, they'll resprout vigorously, and so they'll actually form. Stream restorationists actually really love when beavers cut willows because they'll resprout and actually form a denser shade for the water.
So I think maybe describe how that willow stake responds to being stuck in the ground. Like what happens? The roots come, the stake,
Yeah. In fact, we don't even use rooting compound with willow, and in the literature you can see, and we've done it. If you just stick a bunch of willows in wintertime in a bucket of water, they'll release enough cytokinins and other plant hormones that they'll actually sort of make their own rooting compound. They're really good at this because evolutionarily they're used to getting run over in floodplains and lying down on the ground, and they resprout. So they have an incredible ability to repurpose their stem tissue into new sprouts and new roots. So they root very, very vigorously and will take off in the right conditions.
Okay, let's see. I'm losing.
Oh, and sorry, somebody asked, sorry, I'm looking at the chat now. We were planting mostly Sitka and Schooler's willow. We've tried hooker, but they didn't do well on the site.
Okay. So someone was asking about how to go about looking for land to do restoration on.
Oh, yeah, great. These questions are really fun. You guys are awesome. We did it as a family project, and so we knew this is something we talked about for years, as Susan mentioned. And when we finally had the financial wherewithal to try to say, oh, we really might be able to do this, we looked at a bunch of projects. We wrote to conservation groups all over. We were living in Seattle at the time, and we sort of said, well, let's do a 2-hour radius around the metropolitan area. So we looked at sites in Kittitas County near Ellensburg, Grace Harbor County, and then several in Jefferson County, as it turned out. So we had several conservation groups write back and say, yes, we've got some projects that you might be interested in, come look. And Tarboo Creek is the one that clicked for us. Again, with the idea that this larger community was going to be involved.
So someone was asking about willows possibly dying in the muck. Did you have any loss of plants?
Our success, we haven't, I'm a scientist, I measure things, but we didn't count stakes and success. I would guess, Susan can correct me, maybe you get survivorship maybe 20%, 30% of willow stakes, something like that. If they're in the, we haven't planted them in a really anaerobic muck that's wet year round, where oxygen availability to the roots is going to be a big problem. That would be tough for, as you know, just about anything besides things that are wetland, like flooded area specialists.
Okay, do you plan another new restoration project or continue to work on this one? It seems like plenty of work on its own.
Yeah, it's plenty of work on its own, but we're working mostly on the upland forest now, because we bought several clear cuts that were badly degraded. So that's been our focus right now. The main creek channel, as I mentioned, thanks to Peter Bales and the work that he's been spearheading for 15 years, most of it is in good shape. Most of the land is under conservation easement held by Jefferson Land Trust, either donated by property owners or purchased with grant money, and a lot of the main tributaries. So the main creek channel, the sort of salmon intensive part, or most salmon intensive part, is in really good shape. It's a great sort of local private public conservation success story. But yes, Susan reminds me we're always working on it. But probably more time now for us is spent in the uplands, trying to get diversity increasing in some of these upland forests that we've worked on. So a lot of, and just forestry, thinning and pruning, and planting to diversify.
Let me see. Oh, I lost my question. Are there other fish species in the creek?
Yes. So the salmon species that we see most are coho and chum, and then there's sea-run cutthroat trout that are regular. Historically, they were steelhead. They haven't been seen in decades. There's some historic photos of people with steelhead that they caught out of the creek. Peter Bales looks for reds every March for steelhead, and I think he'll die happy of a heart attack when he finds his first one. But we think steelhead are gone. But they're also, they're lamprey and I mentioned the sea-run cutthroat. Oh yeah, lots. And the aquatic life is really wonderful. There are tons and tons of freshwater mussels, which are really a fantastic indicator of water quality. Lots of crayfish.
Where do you harvest your willow stakes?
We find stands that are intact, and then they resprout vigorously. Now we get them off our property. We're cutting willow stakes off what used to be willow stakes 15 years later. And that's what we were doing this morning, as a matter of fact.
Do you have a lot of holly on the upland forest?
It's Susan is whispering in my ear. That's a sore subject. I think I wrote in the book that our two boys and then Susan and I each have one invasive that we take a personal sort of insult and take it upon ourselves to try to beat back. Mine is blackberry and Susan's is holly. So she saw that in the chat. And, there's some, we have neighbors who have old big trees that generate tons of berries. So the robins are always pooping holly berries all over the place. So yeah, holly's a constant issue.
Okay. Did you happen to look at the GLOW survey, General Land Office survey, or LIDAR before planning or while planning the project?
Yeah, this brings up a really interesting issue. So when Susan's grandfather was writing, and when I was introduced to restoration work doing prairie stuff in the Midwest back in the 1970s and 80s. The whole ecologically, what you were trying to do was go back. It was restore. Like, what did we have in 1848, 1852 when the original land surveys were done? And that was, so yeah, Peter Bales went back and read all those. They talked about Sitka spruce bottom, and we could see quite a few stumps of old growth, especially western red cedars that were still intact. So we had a pretty good idea of what was there, or at least some idea of what the habitat looked like. There were undoubtedly a ton of beaver dams. Almost all streams in Western Washington were huge wetland complexes, just riddled with beaver dams. But the reason this issue is so interesting to me now is that to me, as an ecologist, evolutionary biologist, and restoration person, there's no back. The climate has changed. The 1848 is irrelevant to us now. That we aren't restoring for those conditions. And so one of the things we all have to think about is that we have to plant for the future. I mean, Western red cedars will live 1,000 years or more. Doug firs can live 1,000 years. I've seen them on the peninsula. So we have to be thinking about what are we planting for, and for our great grandchildren to see 100 and 200 years from now. So that the short answer to the question is yes, we looked at the land, or Peter Bales especially looked at the land survey records. I'd argue now that moving forward, we have to think more broadly.
Do you use any herbicides to control invasive plants, or would that be too dangerous for the wildlife?
You have to be, as I'm sure you're all aware, extremely careful with herbicide use, especially around aquatic ecosystems. So we don't use them on the creek property. When we're in uplands way, way, way away from the creek, that's how we treat holly. Actually, we paint stumps. We never, ever, ever do any spraying, even with a backpack sprayer or even a mister bottle. So we'll paint stumps occasionally, but that's our extent of our herbicide use. We try to be highly targeted with it.
So it seems like many of the animal species have come back naturally. Can any animals be introduced, including salmon, or reintroduced?
Yeah, steelhead could probably be reintroduced from hatchery reared fish. No one involved in the project has attempted that yet. The major wildlife reintroduction project on the peninsula is Fisher. If you're familiar with them, they're in the mink weasel family. They're like a gigantic mink, and they're doing very nicely. In fact, there may be some in our neighborhood. One of the stations that the Fisher group set up is somewhere on our property. They won't tell us because they don't want anybody messing with it. But they'll put stations up with sticky stuff to catch hare, and trail cameras and scent stations up. So Fisher are a replant. So yes, some of the salmonids could be reintroduced artificially. And I'm trying to think what else would be a target. But you're right, a lot of stuff has come back. Like if we give wildlife half a chance, if we create the habitat, we do good work with our plants, a lot of good things will follow.
Would you plant trees from further south to plan for climate change, or?
Yeah, this is where my ecologist friends start to raise their eyebrows at me and with me. We've been extremely cautious about that. Our son Peter has planted some Oregon ash. That's the first thing that we've planted that's out of current range, but probably headed our way. We haven't planted any of the cedars from Oregon yet. We've refused. We had a query from a group that's trying to bring redwoods farther north, and I consulted with some colleagues who are real community ecologists, and they just, it's called assisted migration, if you've heard that term, and it's just fraught. And you folks know that moving plants around can be really troublesome. Plants don't exist by themselves. They've got fungi and viruses and bacteria and a million things that depend on them, and they're not isolated. So the reality is that yes, things are moving north, and we're sort of feeling our way. You guys, we're all making this up as we go along, and have to try to make good decisions and live with the consequences. But we're being extremely cautious.
Okay. How successful is the cut stump treatment on holly?
We've been very, yeah, Susan is raising both thumbs. Holly nemesis here. We've been very successful so far, especially late summer. And again, just stump painting. And you know, we concentrate on the cambium and just try to put a little ring right around the outside of the tree, right after it's cut.
Okay, and there is one more question that's in the Q&A, but for some reason I'm not getting it to appear. So if that person would like to retype that into the chat, I got the chat rolling really well.
Oh, I can see it.
Oh, there we go.
What advice would you give to someone who's interested in starting a project like this? Same advice I give to almost anything in life is find some people you really love to do it with. So find a community, folks in the neighborhood, if it's a restoration project, or friends and family who have an interest in the outdoors, but maybe no expertise yet, or just folks who want to learn together. And then talk to some people who know things like, you know, use this society. You guys are an immense resource for each other about what to do. County agents can be helpful, or folks like Peter Bales or folks with a lot of restoration experience can be very helpful. There are good native plant nurseries run by the Washington Association of Conservation Districts. And yeah, Susan has just reminded me, do it in your backyard. It was really struck, I've recently been very slow to come on papers that are documenting, if you're planting exotics as landscaping plants, the number of like insect larvae, butterfly, caterpillars especially, that will use exotic trees is you can count with one hand. Like typically 4 or 5 different species will use a tree from Europe or Asia as food. And a typical native species from the same area will have hundreds. So we're creating these deserts for wildlife in our backyards. And you look at the expanses, especially in suburban areas, we could do a ton of restoration outside our doors.
Great. Do you have any Gary oak on your property?
We do not. That's when our son Peter is also very interested in. He lived in South Sound for a while, south of Olympia in Southwest Washington for a while, and loved the Gary oak openings there. And as we've started to play with the idea of possibly bringing some up here on some of our drier sites, but none were here when we started.
Do you, there were several questions sort of around the types of plants you're doing. Do you have a plant list that you, and is it available somewhere?
Ooh, out of our heads, I think we could generate one. There was one when the original planting plan got put together. We did mostly the usual suspects for you know, mesic to wet forest, especially lowland forest in Western Washington and the eastern part of the peninsula. The other thing we do differently is that we put shrubs in, and now it's one of those, oh my God, what were we thinking? Because the shrub survival was 0. And you think, gosh, why are we surprised? They're used to growing under a canopy. So one of the active planting we're doing now is to put in a shrub and herbaceous layer under, because the canopy is closing with the trees getting 30, 40 feet high. So yeah, we're let's see, like the shrub layer we're putting in now are both Oregon grapes. We're putting in a lot of huckleberries. We have red and evergreen here, and a lot of sword ferns, a few deer ferns. Yeah, lots of salal. Susan's reminding me of everything. Yeah, and in the wet spots, I think it ticked off 9-bark, red osier dogwood, spirea, the willows. Those are doing well.
Well, great. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you, Susan, for helping and fill in the blanks. And I would appreciate that. I did learn about dyeing fabric with holly. So that's going to be my neighborhood, whack the holly and use it as a dye plant. So yay, get rid of that holly, which is very hard to do, I know. So I'm going to try also some of the stump painting. I think that will probably be great. So thank you much for your just wonderful presentation telling about this great area. And we will look forward to hearing more about the progress. That will just be great.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here with you guys again tonight. But most of all, really, thank you for the work you're doing. It is so important to the world. Please believe that. We're going through the greatest ecological crisis in probably 65 million years, and you're the folks who are doing something about it. So thank you.
Great. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. So next we're going to have Sarah Hammond, who is our WNPS research chair. She took over that position, so she'll be evaluating the research grants or leading that team. So very cool. So Sarah, I did, yeah, I made you presenter so you can switch over. And thank you again, Scott and Susan. This has been just a lot of fun and a lot of good comments, lots of comments coming in about thanking you for the work that you've done. So.
All right, am I good to go? Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes, good.
All right. Well, before I'm going to share my screen as well. But before I get started, I just want to say to Scott and Susan, also, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. And I use a Sand County Almanac as the textbook for the restoration class that I teach in the master's program at Evergreen. So I decided I needed to choose a book that I would love to read every year for as long as I was teaching the class over and over again. So it's dear to my heart, and I really appreciate all of the work that you do to carry on that legacy.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah. So yeah, I just really, should be hopefully pretty lighthearted. Just want to walk through some of the plants that I was working with and witnessing and appreciating throughout 2020. So really just kind of walk through the seasons. These are chronologically organized, starting from MLK Junior Day in 2020. And so I think the chat should be open, and potentially I think it's possible for everyone to speak as well if you have your, if you unmute yourself. So please feel free to pipe in or mention anything in the chat. I've done my best to identify all the species that I have here, but yeah, feel free to comment as we go. So starting last January, I hosted a volunteer work party over with Oli Ecosystems. I'm the restoration director and a board member there as well. It's a nonprofit conservation organization here in Olympia that focuses on restoring, primarily right now, restoring the West Bay woods over on West Bay of Olympia. And here we have a little friend helping to plant some deer fern. Also there I'm not going to be able to go through all the species there, but we're trying to get the understory reestablished into the site. The West Bay woods has been logged multiple times. And now I think we have about 20 acres that we've acquired and conserved, much of it with a conservation easement. And the main challenge there is removing ivy. The ivy covers did cover pretty much 100% of the property, with blackberry as well, and lots of holly. And so we've been doing the cut and dab method for some of the holly, and that's been nearly 100% successful. But yeah, we're trying to get the understory reestablished, and mid-story reestablished, and overstory. So really trying to restore much of that forest. So I'll have a couple pictures scattered in along the way of what we did last year there. Get the woodland strawberry going there with a bunch of plantings. We found a couple trilliums there, which was exciting, hiding amongst the ivy. So those are hidden here and there in little pockets. And then most of my work is on the prairie. So my day job is as the director of science and a restoration ecologist with now Eco Studies Institute. Up until recently was with Center for Natural Lands Management, if some of you are familiar with that group. And so, is there a question?
Something of hers.
Oh, no, okay. So one of the early season species on the prairies, as I'm sure most of you know, is the shooting star. This is kind of the harbinger of spring, right? One of the species that is not terribly common. It's found in small pockets, but always kind of a joy to find on the prairie. Also, kind of a harbinger of spring here is the western buttercup. This is much more common. You can probably see this while driving along I-5, waving at you from the side of the road, found on most of the prairies in the Northwest. Spring gold, the Lomatium reticulatum. This is also a pretty early season, early phenology, one that is a favorite for, it has a pretty big taproot. It's in the carrot family. So a favorite for the Mazama pocket gophers, but also recognized as a nectar source for several butterfly species, particularly the Taylor's checker spot butterfly. The early blue violet, another fairly early season species, but this can persist throughout much of the spring and even into the summer on the prairies, along with its kind of sister violet here, the yellow prairie violet, Violet viola primorsa, that has much fuzzier leaves, longer petiole, and not quite as showy until you kind of get really close to the ground to be able to see the flowers. The field chickweed, this is one that we, that has actually done really well with native seeding out on a lot of disturbed sites. So a lot of the work that we do on the prairies involves kind of utilizing the restoration process, which really requires invasive removal initially. Usually we're taking some pretty degraded lands that are covered by Scotch broom or non-native grasses like tall oak grass or several other perennial grasses. Now we're starting to see more annual grasses, which is a little concerning. That is kind of following the pattern that California has seen for years. So we're working hard to stay on top of that. But then we usually conduct prescribed burning in the fall after we've been able to remove invasive weeds, particularly Scotch broom. And then we have a series of native seeding and planting efforts in the fall and winter. And chickweed does really well in these disturbed sites and gets established pretty quickly. So this has been become one of the species we've ramped up production of on our native seed farm. For the bicolored lupin, this is one that I love going out after a rain and seeing all the little prairie diamonds. I think I take pictures of this every single year. It's just such a precious thing out there. All the little, the diamonds and the lupins, pretty close to the ground here. The little bicolored lupins usually don't get, oh gosh, maybe more than 6 or 7 inches tall. So, you know, tiny plants out there that play a big role. They're really good. They get established pretty well out on the prairie and are early season annual species as well. Back to the forest. We did a lot of planting of skunk cabbage early on. There's in the West Bay woods, for anyone that hasn't been out there, there are some trails that you can hike through, accessing them either off of West Bay Drive or Dickinson Avenue or Hayes Avenue Northwest, just north of the West Side Co-op, if you're all familiar with that area. But there's some seeps and springs that have created these kind of wetland areas where we had reed canary grass and mostly ivy, actually. And so now that that's removed, we put in a bunch of skunk cabbage and some willows, and we're excited to see these skunk cabbage plants getting established, along with several different species of ferns. And here's kind of a bigger picture of one of the small areas, wetter areas. You can see kind of the line of green in the back. That's the ivy that we're just working on pushing that wall back. It's a labor of love for sure. Another species we planted in there is the fringe cup, Telaima grandiflora. This is one, I think actually I have about 1,000 of these to plant next Monday for this year's MLK Junior Volunteer Planting Day. So there's going to be a lot of these filling in the spaces where ivy once lived. And then Western Starflower, this is one of my favorites, just so dainty and beautiful. I think this is actually from my backyard, but every year I just love seeing these come up. Oh, there's another shot of that. So back to the prairie, we work a lot with private landowners, and this was a very exciting moment to see golden paintbrush come up on a ranch out on the Skookumchuck. This is at the Riverbend Farm, where we've been working with the landowner and with several other ranchers in the South Sound to adjust the grazing rotations. So institute some smaller paddocks where cattle can be grazed in short durations and removed from certain areas during the spring growing period. And then we seed native species in the fall and hope for the best. And so far we've seen some pretty great responses by instituting this conservation grazing practice, and we were able to get some golden paintbrush established at this farm and a couple others with this process. So we're going to be tracking that over the next few years to see. I mean, this is just one little plant, but we saw a couple patches. This was just the first one that we found there, and it was an exciting moment. So here, obviously, the star of the show is the golden paintbrush in this picture, but I wanted to highlight also the giant blue-eyed Mary, the Collinsia grandiflora. This is out at Tenalquat Prairie, for those of you that might be familiar. It's over by the town of Rainier. Here, this is, I think, the Nature Conservancy and then Center for Natural Lands Management acquired this property back in 2006 and done some pretty extensive restoration. It used to be a horse pasture, mostly dominated by non-native grasses, and it's pretty spectacular now with you can see the fescue bunches, that kind of silvery Romer's fescue, the blue-eyed Mary, there's a lomatium hiding over here, and then obviously this golden paintbrush showing off. And yeah, there's been a lot of restoration effort, and actually Taylor's checker spot butterflies were reintroduced there this spring. So that was back in February. So that was a long-term goal for the site. And so we're hopeful that they'll hang on there and get established amongst all the native plants that exist there now. Back to some of the work at the farms. This was actually at Colvin Ranch. At first, I thought this was the largest number of flowers, the greatest number of flowers I've ever seen on a camas. I think there's over 40 flowers. But this is, it's hard to see, but there's actually 2 stems here. So there's 2 camas plants, but still an impressive display, just really reflecting the higher nutrient availability at the ranch sites. At Colvin Ranch, for those of you that aren't familiar, this is down by Tenino. Fred Colvin the property has been in his family since the mid-1800s, when Ignatius Colvin settled on the land, and they've been grazing cattle sustainably ever since. And he uses a conservation grazing program and has and I'll show you some additional pictures, but some incredible diversity and abundance of native species there, including camas. And you can see here, just below the flowers, you can see kind of the graze line where the cattle had munched off the leaves of the camas that was growing adjacent to this one. And then basically he uses camas as his as the trigger to as soon as the camas buds start to come up above the soil surface, he moves the cattle off of the paddocks onto quote sacrifice paddocks that don't have native plants on them. So that way the native seeds that are in the soil, the native perennials that have the root systems established have time to come up. And so he has no cattle grazing on his native pastures from about mid-April to mid-June. And often you'll see camas plants that have the nibbled leaves send up pretty spectacular flowering displays. And so they don't seem to be damaged too much by that early cattle grazing. They can recover pretty easily. This is also on Fred Colvin's site, some really incredible balsam root that line the hillside of his property. And balsam root is, I call it like the Club Med of the prairie. I don't know if not many people anymore know, I've heard of Club Meds. Like, anyway, every pollinator out there hangs out on the balsam root. So this is a species that attracts, well over 60 or 70 species of pollinators that congregate, including the Taylor's checker spot butterfly, and has really deep tap roots that can go down 6 to 10 feet. And so it can access additional nutrients and water resources that many of the other native plants and grasses cannot. So, and a really important resource, both above ground and below ground for the prairies. This was one of the species we seeded at Fred Colvin's into his grazing paddocks that hadn't been there before, the 9-leaf biscuit root. And here it's a very happy plant getting established into his native paddocks. Another great resource for butterflies. This was just so beautiful. This early camas, I couldn't resist it. It's just so graceful just before the flowers bloomed. And here are the cows that are coming back onto the pastures. Like I said, he puts the cattle back on when the, basically when the camas are done flowering. Here you can still see there's a couple camas flowering there, but most of them have completed their flowering time. And so they're going to seed. The cattle generally avoid the camas once it's done flowering. And so it allows the seeds to ripen, and they walk around and knock seeds out of the seed pods that are just basically little cups. And the camas is sustained there. So it worked out to be a pretty good relationship with cows on his site. Also at the Colvin Ranch, there's a pretty incredible golden paintbrush display. And I'm guessing most folks are familiar, but golden paintbrush is a federally threatened species. So it's one that has a lot of effort around it in terms of promoting its recovery. So we planted, I think, like 70 or 80 plants along this hillside back in 2014. And this was the picture this spring in late May. The paintbrush, I think there was over 200 plants on this hillside, and we had planted them in a straight row, kind of following the middle of the slope here, just right along the edge, and they have expanded up and down slope. Really happy little population of paintbrush there. So we're hopeful that that will be maintained. And this is actually grazed by horses. So they seem to do well with his grazing, horse grazing strategy here. Just a few feet away is the sickle-keeled lupin, Lupinus albicollis. Yeah, just looking over the rest of his paddocks on the site. So we also are working through the Center for Natural Lands Management and Eco Studies, and a group that we formed called the Camas Collaborative with several tribes. We're working with the Chehalis tribe to increase access to historic tribal lands, and to utilize and kind of prioritize harvesting practices, basically as part of the management process, recognizing that, we've been able to return fire to the landscape in a lot of places, but harvesting of some of the native species, primarily camas, but some of these others that I'll point out here, like Brodea, have not been harvested for hundreds of years in some cases. And so both restoring that, restoring the indigenous practice and the cultural practice with the tribes, and also restoring that disturbance to the prairie soils provides an opportunity to really integrate those cultural priorities back into this landscape. So part of that project, part of that effort has involved going out with the Chehalis tribe to one of their parcels that we're working with them to restore. And we did a quick survey. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do it until later in the season, but we found some of these species that this was a site that was heavily dominated by Scotch broom, and it has a beautiful oak woodland there, or oak savanna, but the Doug fir have moved in, and it's going to require some pretty serious removal of Doug fir that have overtopped the oaks. So there's a lot of work ahead. We've already brush cut about 20 acres of Scotch broom. So we're hoping to see, well, one, there's going to be a lot of baby Scotch broom coming back next year, but hoping to see a lot of these native species really show up in the spring once they've been released. So we found crown brodea there, doing our kind of late summer survey. White brodea, the Tritelia hyacinthina. We did find quite a bit of camas. And then common self-heal, the Prunellus vulgaris, which it's easily, for me, this species is often easily overlooked. It flowers late in the season, and it's fairly common, but man, it's beautiful when you really look closely. So I just wanted to highlight this common but really gorgeous native plant out there on the prairies, and often in people's backyards as well. I took a quick trip up to the mountains later midsummer and just want to document a few of the species I saw. This was up outside of the Salmon-Lassac area. The yellow avalanche lily, Erythronium grandiflorum, usually one of the first things to come up after the snow melts. Also, one of my favorite alpine species, the elephant's head, Pedicularis groenlandica, I believe is the pronunciation. And this is where it was located. This is in the Scatter Creek Valley. Just coming up out of the Salmon-Lassac area. Highly recommend checking it out. Oh, and this was just a picture. I think just from the photo, I counted like 12 or 13 different native species. This was in one of the meadows there. But you have Castelleas, the lupins, the phlox. There's some kind of lomatium, yarrow. Oh gosh, I know there were a lot more when I was looking earlier, but if folks want to add to the chat what they see here, this is something, it was spectacular just looking through these meadows and seeing what was coming up. And there were patches of snow, less than 10 feet away. So it was pretty early in the season. Okay, and this, I swear this is not altered. This was, I think this is alpine paintbrush, and folks correct me if I'm wrong here. So this is up in the Norse Peak Wilderness, actually, hiking through what was part of the Norse Peak wildfire. This is one of the meadows here. You can see you can see where it's located in the high severity burn area, just a little ways away. Just these eye-popping Castelleas there that were just really, really stunning coming up in that valley. And then back down to the prairie to catch some of the late season species. The harsh paintbrush hung on for quite a bit this year. We had a bit of a wetter spring, so things really held on late into the summer. The harsh paintbrush here, you can also see some Oregon sunshine, the yellow flowers. That's Areophyllum lanatum. And then some Farewell to Spring, which I think I have another photo of, the Clarkia amoena. And this is at one of our restoration sites, Violet Prairie Preserve, where there's been a total conversion of a non-native dairy farm to really diverse dense native prairie species. The soil fertility is very high there, so the native plants are gigantic. Don't necessarily represent, potentially historic prairies on the low quality soils, but pretty impressive nonetheless. Here's one of the Farewell to Springs, which are just stunning up close, the Clarkia amoena. Similarly, the late season showy fleabane, the asters, and the large flowered Colomia, all of which we've seeded into those sites and are doing very well. And the Colomia have gotten really well established. It's hard walking through, they get really sticky, so your hands and pants and everything will be covered, but you can see the little balls of resin on the plant here. So that's something that when in a field of Colomia, you end up all covered in Colomia resin. Quick trip back up to the mountains and saw this. I don't know if you all saw a lot of this, the ghost plant this year. I saw a lot of posts on the Native Plant Society Facebook page and others of people asking, what is this? Is this a plant or is this some fungus? It seemed to be a good year for the ghost plant. I don't know what the conditions are that really promotes this specifically, but apparently this year had it. So saw quite a bit of this up in the mountains this year, this late summer. And then on the last mountain trip, this is actually up in the Olympics on the High Divide. One of another favorite alpine species, the bog gentiana calicosa. It's hard to see, but zoomed in on these flowers, it's just so beautiful with the little speckled, with the speckled petals. So yeah, really a really beautiful flower that I know is found in a lot of places, but to me it means the alpine in the mountains. So it's a really pretty flower to see blooming. And then this one, I don't know if folks have any ideas. There were a couple patches of this really gorgeous, like a soft rose castanea. And I haven't seen this color variant before. And so I wasn't sure if, I mean, I know castanheas are known to have, you know, almost every color of the rainbow, but if folks have any thoughts on what species this is, I'm not sure. But it was just such a pretty color, one that I hadn't seen before. This was, oh, well, this is what the view was where I took it. This was just it's on the High Divide Trail in Olympic National Park. So that's looking at Mount Olympus. So pretty high elevation and really exposed on kind of a hillside. So beautiful flower, and I'm just not sure if it's just a variant of the alpine paintbrush or something else. So any thoughts there are welcome. And then just a few more here. Headed back downhill and down to the prairies. I was doing gopher monitoring this fall, which really just involves kind of walking through established plots and looking for gopher mounds. And I got to see a lot of the kind of the end of the season for a lot of these species. So when they've either formed their seed and already released them, or they're just forming their seeds. And so here we have Armeria maritima, sea thrift. Usually this is just a really nice soft pink set of flowers, but here you can see it's already gone to seed and it's beginning to senesce for the season. The white-top aster, I always miss this when it's in flower. I usually catch just the vegetative stage and then when it's already gone to seed. So the Styracocarpus rigidus, this was over at Wolf Haven Prairie down in the South Sound here, where we've done a lot of restoration and planting and seeding. And there's quite a bit of the white-topped aster there. Oh, and this is a really nice graceful species here. I just love the graceful curve of the stem. So the harebell, the Campanula rotundifolia, is one of the latest flowering species that we have on the prairies. And I think one or two more photos here. The slender cinquefoil, so this was also at Wolf Haven, like days after we burned the site. So we did a prescribed burn at Wolf Haven Prairie, and a few days later I was out there looking for gopher mounds, and there were quite a few fresh gopher mounds in the burned unit, and these cinquefoil coming up just right away after the fire, just capitalizing on the nutrients and water and light that was available there. So good to see natives coming up into those burn units. Goldenrod is all around the prairie. We have a couple different species, but this one here, the Missouri goldenrod, in the sunshine, Solidago missouriensis. This, I think, is actually on Joint Base Lewis McChord on Johnson Prairie, where there's quite a few patches of Missouri goldenrod. And then to finish here, just a gorgeous view of the Gary Oaks that we're working to protect and restore. This again is on Joint Base Lewis McChord, but on a beautiful late fall day. I think this was in October when we had a little break from the rain and some sunshine. So I think I will end there and see if there are any comments or questions.
Hey, Sarah, there were a couple questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I didn't.
Where is West Bay Woods?
Oh, West Bay Woods is, let's see, for folks that are familiar with West Olympia, basically it's about 22 acres that exists between Braun Avenue that runs east-west, and what's the northern end, like Farwell, that also runs east-west. It butts up against West Bay Drive and on the east, and on the west, it goes up to, not all the way to Rogers, but basically it's between West Bay Drive and Rogers in West Olympia. And it's pretty much almost all of the undeveloped land is now protected. And there's a trail running through much of it, not all of it yet, but there will be a trail that runs eventually through all of it. It'll be over a mile of trail, I think, once we get it established.
That might be fun for us to do a hike there and do a plant ID and register at the, yeah, great.
Yeah, I'd be happy to coordinate that or organize that.
And also because many people know you and have worked with you, could you just describe a little bit about the transition with CNLM? And
oh, sure.
Because I think that was what this question was about, because that was asking if you said used to be CNLM. So
okay.
Just describe that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for catching that. Okay, to clarify, so several folks from CNLM have transitioned over to a different entity. So CNLM still, the Center for Natural Lands Management, still owns the prairie preserves and the native seed farm in the South Sound. So all of that is still with CNLM and is still functioning as it has in the past. So Saunders Freed, if you guys know Saunders and his program, and the seed farm and that program, all is still going strong with CNLM. The research programs and the fire program and the cooperative conservation and outreach programs have all moved over to this other entity called Eco Studies Institute. And really that was mostly driven by just kind of differences in priorities and the need to be a bit more nimble with a smaller organization and locally focused. So the Eco Studies Institute actually is a nonprofit that was started back in 2001 by Gary Slater, who is an avian ecologist, previously with CNLM. And it's historically was focused on avian ecology and research and education, but we're expanding the scope to focus on just overall conservation, restoration, and research. I should say cooperative conservation, restoration, and research. So those programs are now with Eco Studies. We're working very closely with CNLM. I mean, every day we're working together on one project or another. So it's still kind of a cohesive team, but we just have different umbrellas. Are there other questions?
Just one more. She was just confirming that we're good for another year, which I think so. Yeah.
Good for another year. What are you referring to?
I think just the transition that there will still be volunteering and restoring prairies for at least another year.
Yes. So the volunteer program. Oh, absolutely. I mean, yes, in perpetuity, I expect there's going to be a volunteer program, and the volunteer program is probably Angela that manages the volunteer program, Angela Winter. She's staying with CNLM, and so she works with Saunders and the restoration program. So that working at Glacial and working on all of the CNLM properties, that is all staying put. So and I mean, certainly more than a year. Like we expect that to continue forever, as much as as long as we're around, and hopefully much longer. to continue to have opportunities to volunteer and work on the prairies. Yeah.
And Regina Johnson was asking, could you talk about working with the tribes?
Sure. Hey, Regina. So the Camas Collaborative is a group that myself and Joyce LeCompte, who's an ethnobotanist from University of Washington, and Alita Post from Squaxin Island Tribe, and there's about 6 tribes or 7 tribes that I think are key players: the Muckleshoot, the Quinaults, now the Chehalis is involved. Like I said, the Squaxin Island, the Nisqually, the Swinomish up north, and then others have been involved but not been part of the kind of founding. It's a group that's really focused on, right now, just a collaborative. We're not like a formal nonprofit or anything at this point, but focused on increasing access to prairies to harvest traditional food plants, and also increasing kind of the education around Indigenous priorities and practices on the prairies. So educating those of us working in prairies and working together to really better integrate some of those traditional and Indigenous practices into our prairie management. So those are the primary goals. Certainly there's a lot that fall within that. But there is a website I'd be happy to share. I believe it's if you look up Camas Collaborative, should be able to find it. Although there is a business collaborative or a collaborative of businesses in Camas, Washington that comes up as well. So that's something to keep an eye out for. But yeah, so it's a group that's working with the tribes to, and led by the tribes and by their priorities to integrate Indigenous priorities into prairie management.
All right, super. So, and Sherry, she's happy because she wants to continue seed collecting. So next year,
Great.
We got it's this year now. We changed over to the years. So cool.
Yeah. Well, that will continue for sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah. This has been great. I don't know if you guys all know, but the reason why we had these, what Sarah has helped me name, is I'm calling it the botanical interlude.
Oh, great.
In order for me to turn you all on, so you all now have availability to turn on your mics and your video, and we can chat. But I need some time to do that. So we've instituted this botanical interlude to give me time to make that transition. So Deb, do you want to take to?
Well, first I want to thank Sarah for the slides. They were great. And yeah, it makes me eager to get back out on the prairies too, and in the mountains. I hope everybody has a chance to do that. So yeah, I just wanted to invite everyone. You know, we're really missing our chapter meetings. And so we're trying to use this time as a way, you know, after a meeting, you'd all kind of drift around and chat with folks. And so this is our opportunity. So please feel free to start your video, unmute yourself, say hi, let us know how you're all doing. I just miss seeing everybody's face. So